Alright, let me go through this chapter or unit again before we move on to unit 8. Language and context, or language and register. First of all, let's define register and then look at the determinants of register and then some other issues related to register. So what is a register? Register is a variety of language. The language we speak is not all the same. Rather, depending on the situation and depending on the addressee, the person to whom we are talking or addressing, and depending on whether the medium of communication is writing or speech, the context or the kind of language we use will be different. So we do not use one kind of language all the time. So whether we do this consciously or unconsciously, subconsciously, there are varieties of language that suit certain contexts. And so what might be suitable in a given or a certain context might not be suitable in another context. Again, depending on the context, depending on the addressee we are addressing, depending on the medium of communication, and also the kind of relationship we have with the addressee, a social relationship. Whether he is a superior, for example, my boss at work, or someone subordinate like, my child, my son, a worker working for me. And so language does vary according to the situation. This is known as register. Language varies according to the situation. Let me, before going into some details, let me start by introducing the concepts, context of culture, and context of situation. Every instance of language takes place in two contexts. Every piece of communication, every utterance, written or spoken, or even signed, every utterance or instance of communication takes place in two contexts, necessarily. The context of culture, and that's the larger context, and then the context of situation. When two Malays speak, they are bound by a certain context, and that is the context of the Malay culture. And so they draw upon the Malay culture in their communication. Two Englishmen speaking to one another, communicating with one another, have also a cultural context or a context of culture where the communication takes place within their culture, the English culture. They draw upon figures, they celebrate, they talk, so culture, things that bound all the speech community in a given geographical location. So the Tamil, the Indians here, for example, in Malaysia, also have a context of culture. Okay, to some extent, the Tamils or the Indians in Malaysia, for example, they share a wider context, and that is the context of Malaysia. To some extent, you all share the same values advocated by this cultural context. But also each one of you belongs to another also language community within Malaysia, the Tamil community, the Malay community, the Chinese community. And so each of you draws upon, a certain culture. For example, Muslims here, when they want to celebrate, they have, for example, the Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha, Hari Raya, and what's the other Raya? What's the other Eid?
Raya Haji.
Raya Haji, which is gonna, be in maybe in a month or a month and a half time. But when the Indians, for example, celebrate here in Malaysia, they have a different kind of festival season, the Deepavali, for example. And the Chinese also have their own. And so whatever communication people communicate, it takes place within a context of culture. Arabs together, they have the context of culture. And language and culture, you probably know, are interrelated. We become acculturated through language. We get to learn about our culture and its norms through language. And so children, as they grow up in a certain speech community, they become acculturated, they become socialized using or through language. They get to know the cultural norms, the values, what is okay, what is not okay, all through language. The other context is that of situation. This is the immediate context where an instance of communication takes place. Like maybe this communication now between you and me. And the context of situation takes place, as I said, within the larger context, and that is of culture. Now, the context of situation is determined by three factors. And these can be seen on pages 80 and 81. So now we're coming to the context of situation. The context of situation may vary from a situation to another depending on the context, and so resulting in a different register. So what are the factors that determine the register or the context of a situation? There are three. These are the mode or medium of communication, the tenor or tone of communication, the tenor, and the last factor or determinant is the field or role. These three constitute a certain register, a certain variety of language. So we call them, or I call them, the determinants of register or text. Why determinants? Because they determine the kind or variety of language, the kind of language to be used. The mode means the mode or medium of communication. And so the mode is the medium of communication, whether it's writing, for example, or speech. It is the form of textualization. The form of textualization. simply the means of communication, writing or speech. Let's look at the speech first and then writing. Okay. Speech is usually made up on the spot. Speech is made up usually on the spot, spontaneously. We don't think much as in writing. And interpret it as it is heard. Now you are listening to me, so you are interpreting, processing information as you hear it. You have no time to process it the way you process written information. And so the language, when I know that the medium I am using is speaking, so I have to speak in a way that will be easy for the audience or the addressee to follow. In writing is different. The addressee has time to process information, to read and reread. And so I might use complex sentences as a writer. I might edit, I might proofread, I might change. I have time also. Writing, on the other hand, as I said, may involve long periods of composition. You have time and revision, and the resultant text may be read or reread at leisure. You have time to process information. In circumstances quite remote. You might be reading a text written by Shakespeare or written by a companion of the Prophet more than 1,000 years ago. So in circumstances quite remote in time and place, temporal dimension and also physical dimension, both in time and place, from that in which it was written. Written texts therefore tend to be more formal than spoken texts. So speech comparatively tends to be informal, which by contrast tend to be looser and more provisional in their structure and to feel less formal. Speech. In addition, speech and writing may also be shaped according to whether they pass through other media. For example, a telephone conversation is not the same as a face-to-face chat. Okay, both are spoken, but the way we talk face-to-face is not exactly the way we talk on the phone. So there will be slight changes. And so the medium of communication affects the kind of language we use. That's the point. So when we write something and when we speak something, the kind of language we use will not be exactly the same. So it will be different depending on this or that medium of communication. All right? Yesterday, I complained to the head of the English department about something, and she said that she didn't know about it. This was on the phone. She didn't know about it, and that she would, bring the issue to the deputy dean. And the deputy dean contacted me on that day and asked me to write an email explaining my complaint. So now the kind of language I used on the phone during the telephone conversation was different or would be different from the language I would write in the email. Because of the difference in the medium. One is written, one is spoken. The level of formality will be different, for example. The vocabulary I might use might be different, some of it at least. And so one way that determines a difference or a variety in language is then the mode or medium of communication. Let's move on to another determinant, and that is the tenor. I have written these words in the chat for you, the chat column, the tenor. What is the tenor? The tenor refers to the social relationships of participants in the situation, which determines the tone. The social relationship between the speaker and the addressee, between the speaker and the interlocutor, what kind of relationship they have. Is one a boss and the other a subordinate? Are they equals? Are they co-equals? Are they intimates? Are they disparates? Are they relatives? A father with his son, a wife with her husband, a high-ranking police officer with a certain citizen, the president or the prime minister with the ra'yat. So the relationship between the participants also determines the kind of language to be used. And so now you can imagine the language used, for example, between a husband and a wife will be different from the language used by the husband or the wife with her or his boss. Will not be the same. The language used between a child and his mother, and the mother and her child, the child with his teacher, will be different. The way you speak to me will be different from the way you speak to your classmates. Should not be the same. Okay, we're using still English, but the register or the variety, the vocabulary, the syntax will not be exactly the same. We vary language according to register, according to a situation, the context of situation. Okay, let's give an example. Let's see what word you can use for the word toilet, depending on the situation, the context of situation. Let's say that you are on board aeroplane. You are on a plane boarding an aircraft, and you want to go to the toilet. So you ask the flight attendant, excuse me, miss or Ms, may I know where what word will you use to talk about the toilet, to ask for the toilet? Which word would be most appropriate in this situation? Of course you can use the toilet, but if you were a more competent speaker, you would vary the register, choose another kind of language, because you are in a situation different from other situations. So what language will you use? What word will you use to describe the toilet, for example? Okay, a good speaker of English will use the word lavatory. It's in the chat. Excuse me, may I know where the lavatory is? I need to go to the lavatory. Lavatory. Okay. You are in a public place, in a shopping mall, for example, and again you want to look for the lavatory. You ask a shop assistant, or you ask the at the information desk, or even a passerby. So what word will you use to ask for the toilet? You won't say lavatory, of course, because this is not the right context for lavatory. So what would you use? I am asking you. Come on. Excuse me. Can you tell me where the way to the, what would you say? No idea. What
about washroom?
It's not that you cannot say the washroom. You can say, but what I am hinting at is, in your case, it's the ladies, and in the case of men, it's the gents. So a man would say, excuse me, what is the way to the gents, please? That is, it is short for the gentleman's room, a clipped form for gentleman's room. So in a public place, using gents and ladies would be more appropriate. It's a question of appropriacy. Appropriacy, accuracy, and effectiveness, and so communicative competence. Okay, what about if you were in the forest or a jungle or outdoors and you want to go to the toilet? Would you ask for the gents here? Or the lavatory? That's when you are on aircraft. That would be a loo. A hole in the ground where you can dig it, or where you can, a hole in the ground, an improvised toilet. And so using loo, if you are, for example, in a shopping mall and you want to go to the toilet and you ask for the loo, that would be inappropriate. You are mixing registers inappropriately, or using a word that should not be suitable in this context. When a child wants to go to the toilet, what does he say? What do we use with the children going to the toilet? The kind of language appropriate to this kind of addresser and addressee. Oui. Daddy. Oui. Oh, you wanna have a wee baby? Okay, wait. Let me call your mom. Oui. So this is appropriate in this context. 10 years ago, I went to a doctor, and I read in the report he wrote, I came across the word micturate. Here's the word. I came across the word micturate in his report, which I didn't understand. So I looked it up, or I might have asked him, I don't know now. And I found that it simply means urinate. So I thought to myself, why didn't he use the word urinate then? Not wee is for children, but urinate, it's a formal word, appropriate, academic. So I came to know that micturate was used in medical language, in the medical register. And so when two, for example, because the report was not written for me, the report was written for the hospital, for a further investigation. I was asked to take it and go to a hospital for further investigation. And so when doctors communicate, they would use micturate. But when the doctor communicates with me as an ordinary man, he would use urinate. Urinate with me, micturate with a doctor. Different registers, different situations. that dictate different language, variety of language. And so, back to the three determinants of register: the medium or mode of communication, the tenor or relationship, kind of relationship, power relations, power differentials between the speaker and the interlocutor. And the third determinant is the topic or field, the field, that is the subject matter, the subject matter. And we know that language is used for a variety of different purposes. For example, to convey information, to express feelings, to cajole, to seduce, to pray, to make two people get married, united, to make two people get divorced, to produce aesthetic effects. And so, in each of these situations, we use language or field-specific vocabulary. The kind of vocabulary or language used in a legal document will be different from a medical report, as we have seen. The language used in a medical report or a legal document will be different from the language used in the church or the mosque or the temple. And so in each situation, we use language differently, in a way appropriate to this or that context. These are registers. And so there could be as many registers as there are situations or contexts. Fields in this sense include those then occupied by the legal profession, the scientific community, the culinary arts, religious institutions, academic disciplines, advertising, football commentary, and the list could be extended almost indefinitely. So depending on, again, the situation and who is involved in the situation and the subject matter, a certain language or variety of language, a register will be used. I think now we have a good understanding of what we mean by a register and what determines a certain register. Let's move on now and look at another issue. I'm going to write a statement in the chat so that you can contemplate it. Register or registers are specialized discourse types. Registers as a specialized discourse types that are opaque, not easy to understand, opaque to non-specialists. Registers are of set varieties of language. Every one of us varies his or her language according to the situation. And of course, the more vocabulary you have, the more you can navigate the social environment. I might have talked about this in reading skills. The more vocabulary, this is one of the advantages of enlarging your vocabulary, because you will be using the right word in the right situation or in the right register. You will vary your vocabulary and level of formality according to the situation. And so you will know when to use a brawl, when to use a quibble, when to use scuffle, when to use wrangle, when to use fight, when to use quarrel, etc., etc., etc. All these words, by the way, mean to fight. but each one has a different connotation, and so might be used in a different register, whether quibble, brawl, bicker, scuffle, etc., etc., etc. And so the more vocabulary you have, the more appropriately and competently you can navigate the social environment and speak more appropriately, accurately, and competently. Registers are specialized discourse types that are opaque to non-specialists. What does this mean? The registers we become familiar with and learn how to manipulate in higher education, at university, for example, might well be alienating to those who have not had access to them. In fact, one of the purposes of any degree course is to familiarize the student with the special register of the discipline being studied. And so, someone is studying engineering will become familiar with the language used in engineering, the engineering register. Someone studying medicine will be qualified in the language, in the register, in the medical register. Someone studying law will become familiar, will be qualified in the language used in the law, legal register. Someone studying linguistics will become a linguist or a language teacher by virtue of becoming familiar with the language register. And so, people who are outside this community or that community will not be able to understand the language used within this community. Let's take, for example, the medical community, medical practitioners. As I have said, when two doctors communicate, they will be using language that might not be understood by you and me. Though we speak the same language, I mean, they might be speaking English, and we speak English, or any other language in this case, but the language they use is is opaque to us, not clear, not understood, impenetrable to us, because we have not been trained in this kind of discourse, specialized discourse, medical discourse. And so micturate is just an example. I could speak English. Okay, 10 years ago, but I was still at least a teacher of English with a master's in English. So it is not that that my English was not good. No, this was a specialized variety of English. If I wanted to know it, I had to be trained as a medical doctor. And so native speakers of English also outside the medical profession or community, for them also they will not know it unless they studied medicine. And so we can think of registers as specialized discourse types that are opaque to non-specialists. Look at the language also used in the legal profession. And here we have an example. This is an extract taken from a legal notice. Philia, can you read this extract on page 82?
Notice is hereby given that the sheriff at
Philia, you're
Yes.
gonna have a hard time reading it, but it's right.
Notice is hereby given that the sheriff at Campbelltown by interlocutor dated 30th December 1986 ordered all parties desirous to lodge answers in the hands of the sheriff clerk at Castle Hill. Camp Belltown within 8 days of the intimation, advertisement, or service, and in the meantime, until the prayer of the petition had been granted or refused, nominated Alistair White to be provisional liquidator of the said company on his finding caution before extract.
I'll give you $100 if you tell me what it means. What does it mean? You just read it. And it's English, not Japanese. You reading it again? Okay, read it again. Though you have just read it. Why would you read it again when you have just read it? Okay, I'll give you a second chance. Read silently. $100 if you tell me what it means. Okay, can you tell me what it means? From this example, their students, their failure, we can see that the legal register, this is specialized kind of language, a variety of language, is relatively opaque to non-specialists, to the non-specialists. We are not trained in the law profession. We speak English, but we are not trained in this kind, or we don't have a degree in the laws. We are not trained in legal discourse, in this kind of register. Let's briefly analyze this language. Look at page 83. In terms of vocabulary, we find that this legal notice makes use of some archaisms. We talked about archaisms this morning. Words that are no longer in current usage, such as desirous. The vocabulary also of this legal notice makes use of highly Latinate vocabulary. For example, interlocutor, intimidation, petition, nominated, provisional, caution, extract. And one key, of course, to register is vocabulary. Micturate, medicine, urinate, academic, wee, children, piss in the wind, informal. If we look also at syntax, the way words are arranged, we find that this whole sentence, believe it or not, this whole notice is made up of one single sentence. Have you noticed that? From the beginning until the end, there's only one full stop. The whole thing is one sentence, which is a characteristic of legal jargon, of the legal idiom. And so it's a complex sentence made up of a number of subordinate clauses. Syntax makes an equal contribution to this register and to its opacity. Remarkably, the complete notice is made up of a single complex sentence with an array of subordinate clauses whose interrelations with each other are acutely difficult to follow. The typography is also, or the appearance of the printing, we find archaic typography being used, a feature of this register. since it makes extensive use of capitalization for words that are no longer capitalized in modern English. So now we understand the idea of register also as also, apart from the everyday language varieties or registers in everyday language, we have a conversation with a medical professor, a conversation with an assistant in a shop, a conversation or an instance of communication at the train station, or the kind of language that you and me vary in everyday life. Apart from this, also there are specialized registers that are opaque to non-specialists, such as the church, the medical register, the legal register, the church register or religious register, etc., etc. The registers that have not been changed, meaning because some registers have maintained the opacity to non-specialists, such as the legal, as we have said, more noticeably legal register. The same language, for example, that was used 200 years ago, still used in English. I mean, though English has been, we have seen many changes between modern English and Middle English or earlier forms of English, but the language of the legal profession is almost the same. These are known as conservative registers. Registers whose language did not change over time and have maintained their register are known as conservative registers. Now one may ask, but why would the language be difficult? I mean, why don't they change it to a language that we can understand? Well, there could be, of course, we could offer more than one reason. But one reason I like to think of is the issue of power. And language as being a means of power. Knowledge is power. And power is knowledge. Now, when two people say something you do not understand, how do you feel? When two lawyers are talking about an issue related to you, but you do not understand. When two medical practitioners in the operating room talking about something related to you, your father might be on the operating table, and two surgeons are talking, but you do not know what is going on. How do you feel? Tell me. Do you feel strong or weak? Do you feel empowered or do you feel powerless? Answer me.
Feel powerless?
Do you feel that you are in a position of power or in a position of powerlessness? Of course, when we do not understand something and we see other people understanding it, we feel powerless. We feel that we are at the mercy of them. And so language empowers people. Knowledge is power and power is knowledge. The dynamics between power and knowledge and power. Our means to become knowledgeable in a certain register or specialized discourse is language. Meaning there is no way for you to become qualified as a medical doctor without the means of language, because it is language that it trains you and it qualifies you and constrains others. It is language that can make you be familiar with this kind of language, and so this kind of power. The same thing, if you want to know what goes on in the legal profession, and legal tussles and the problems, prosecution, litigation, then you need to be trained in the kind of language used, this kind of knowledge used in the legal profession. And so language can be a means of power. And so why do they keep it difficult and opaque to non-specialists so they can remain and feel empowered? When I know that I have something I do not have, this puts me in a position of power. It gives me an edge that you don't have. You will come to me, please interpret this to me. I don't know what's going on. My father is in hospital and the doctor wrote this report and I don't know what's going on. What is it? It's English, but I don't understand. So please tell me. I am worried. I'm sorry, now I have no time. But if you really want to know what it is, okay, at that office they have a medical practitioner. You can go and but they're gonna charge you for some money. So you go and you're willing to pay some money for someone to interpret it to you, to use language that you understand. So one reason is obvious. Well, I mean, for me it is obvious, but for you it is not obvious. I mean, those who, I mean, they know that that they are in a position of power, but they don't tell you that we maintain this kind of register or this course because we want to be in a position of power. They will not say that, but deep inside they know that. There are other reasons mentioned in this chapter. You can look at them on your own. Let's now move on and look at section 7.3. Any questions so far? Are you delighted? Fatihatu, interested in what I'm saying?
Yes, okay.
A bit or a lot?
Lot.
Literature and register. Literary, okay. Here we have literary registers and non-literary registers. Registers used in literature and registers or varieties of language used in non-literature, like the ones we have mentioned, some examples: legal, medical, technical, computer, academic, football, culinary, depending on the different subjects, the many fields of knowledge and the many situations we might be involved in. And so here we have literature has its own register or registers. Literature has its own register or registers, an issue we're going to look at again today. Literature versus non-literature. Literary works versus non-literary language. And so it seems, or it's obvious, that literature has its own register, language, variety of language, or registers. Whether it's one register or more than one register, an issue we're going to raise in a short while. But definitely literature is distinguished from prose. Literature is distinguished from other language. And so this is one thing. The other thing is that literature also draws on non-literary registers. Consequently, the reader of any literary text needs to be alert to the various non-literary registers that it is voicing and the way that it is engaging with the various possible literary registers that are available from the history of literature. Where are we? The Russian critic Mikhail Bakhtin, in the essay Discourse in the Novel, developed the term dialogism. Dialogism, reminiscent of dialogue. Dialogism. What is dialogism? Dialogism refers to the different voices in a novel which necessitate the presence of different registers. Do you follow, guys? Let me explain this more, but please attention. Dialogism refers to the different voices in a novel. Literature to begin with, especially novels and plays, typically attempts to represent reality. Literature represents reality, people's problems, issues, sex, gender, poverty. So literature represents issues in human life, social worlds, recognizable social worlds in convincing ways, especially the novel. And so, focus with me, and so it is necessary, since literature, and especially the novel, deals with people's lives, deals with a certain a certain class or group of people, or and so there will be more than one voice, i.e. register, in the novel. A conversation taking place between two characters at a restaurant. A conversation taking place between a character and a medical doctor. If there are legal issues involved, so there will be a lawyer, the court, and so another voice, another variety of language will be used in the same novel, which is in itself a register, a literary register. But within this literary register, there are other registers, everyday registers, non-literary registers. A president giving a speech will be using also a register. And so dialogism refers to the different registers or voices, sometimes conflicting voices, in a novel which necessitate the presence of different registers. Are you following, guys? And so the novel itself is a literary register, a language different from the language used in other registers, literary language. But within this literary register, there are non-literary registers, since the novel deals with social worlds, as you can imagine, as I have explained it. So there will be many speech situations that would require different registers. speech situations, at the hairdressers, at the doctors, at hospital, at school, at the market, at Hari Raya, different, a novel. So different speech situations requiring different voices or registers. So we have the literary register, and within it we have a multiplicity of non-literary registers. Are you following? A multiplicity of different and potentially conflicting voices. And so we have mixing here of registers. Register mixing. Register mixing. Fatihatul, are you following me?
Yes, of course.
So here we have a mixture of registers. The novel itself, the literary work as a register, literary, but within it there are many other registers. It's raining and it's getting a bit noisy. There are two examples of registered mixing available on pages 84, 85. There is one, and on page 86, 87 there's another example. We're going to skip one example, the one about Robinson Crusoe, a novel by Daniel Defoe in 1719, and we're going to look at the other example of register mixing, and that is the one by the one by James Joyce in his novel Ulysses, published in 1922. To begin with, James Joyce was a modernist writer. Modernist writer. What does this mean? What does modernism mean? Modernism is a movement in literature and the arts and society that began in the early decades of the 20th century, which departs from traditional or classical forms, hence modernism. So it breaks away from traditional or classical forms, adopting new forms, modernist literature. So it breaks away from traditional forms of literature. This writer, James Joyce, is a modernist writer, and this writer experimented with register mixing, because register mixing is a modernist feature. So some writers tried in their works, literary works, to mix registers, to use more than one register. James Joyce Ulysses, published in 1922, it's a realist novel, epitomizes modernism's use of unmotivated register mixing. You do not know why the writer is mixing registers. Its pages often seem like a rag bag of odds and ends taken from a huge variety of different and usually incongruous registers. Incongruous registers. You cannot make out the relationship between this register and other registers. This mixing. We're going now to look at an example taken, an extract taken from this novel, Ulysses, that shows clearly the mixing of registers or register mixing in this novel. Look at the extract on page 86. The places where the register changes have been numbered. And so there are 8 numbers in this extract. Each number indicates a difference in register, in the variety of language used. Take a minute to look at the extract on your own, on page 86. All right, have you read it? Have you? What is this passage about? What is it describing? You've read it. Can you tell me what is the action being described? What is the act being described? What is going on in the passage? Can anyone tell me?
Is it the act of lighting the fire in the doublet?
It is. It is the act of lighting a fire, yes, in a house, a terraced house in Dublin in the early part of the 20th century in various registers. The religious, the technical, the scientific, that seem too elevated or too precise for this humble action. So, let me read the extract quickly. What did Bloom do? Or maybe we can have someone of you to read it. Anisa, can you read the extract?
What did Bloom do?
Louder, please.
What did Bloom do? He drew 2 small seat chairs to the bookcase door. One for Stephen with his back to the area window, the other for himself when necessary. Dick on one knee, he posed in the grip of post-it, the certificate stick, and various colored pepper and irregular polygons of West Abraham Poe at 21 shilling a ton from the yard of Rose Flower and Donald of 14 Lake Oil Street. it had three projecting points of paper with one inconclusive match, thereby minimizing the potential energy contained in the fluid by allowing its carbon and hydrogen atom to enter into free union with the oxygen of the air. Of what similar accreditation is definitely due.
So the act, as I said, being described is that of lighting a fire. But there is more than one register used in the act of describing lighting a fire. In order to identify the various registers here, we need to identify the context in which each one would usually occur. Now, if you look at the table on page 87, you can see these eight registers in which they can or may occur, which are all grouped in this passage. Number one, what did Bloom do? This is a catechism. What's a catechism? In Christian teaching, a catechism is a way of teaching Christianity using questions and answers. You ask a question, you read, for example, a booklet made up of questions and answers. And so the passage begins with a question, and so this way of presenting information is known in Christian teaching as catechism. And notice after this passage, look at 8, another question of what similar apparitions did Stephen think. And so this way, this register is appropriate to Christian teaching. It is used in the novel. Move on. The second one, he drew 2 spoon-seat deal chairs to the hearthstone, one for Stephen with its back, blah blah blah. This is descriptive prose. We are moving from catechism to descriptive prose, another register. And then 3, knelt on one knee, composed in the great apire. Knelt on one knee. This kind of language is used in a religious context. Pyre and knelt down as though he wants to pray. So religious. And then we move after that, we find a technical register of polygons, and the same thing is being repeated in sentence 6. Look at 6. Kindled it at the 3 projecting points of paper with one ignited lucifer match. Not a kind of literary language or religious, or so this is technical description as though it's written in a report. And then we move 5, language of commerce, advertising. 5, of best Abram coal at the 21 shillings, blah blah blah. So moving into another type of language. And then 7, scientific description, the kind of language used by scientists. Look at 7, thereby releasing the potential energy contained in the fuel by allowing its carbon and hydrogen elements to enter into free union with the oxygen of the air. What can I see? Are we reading now a scientific article in a journal? And then we go back to catechism. register mixing, polyphony of voices. You don't know whether you are reading a scientific report, an academic journal paper, a religious text, an ad, a mixture of registers, non-literary registers. The mixing of registers in this passage not only produces comic effects, humorous effects, but also raises a series of unsettling speculations. What does the author mean? What is the correct interpretation? Okay, it is funny, it makes you amused. Religion, science, advertisement, commerce. See, it is comic, but it raises the question of what does the author want to say? What is the correct interpretation? So you speculate. Literary registers. Move on. The last section here. One of the ongoing debates in literary criticism and literary theory is whether literature has its own register or registers. Literature one register, whether poetry, plays, novels, all literary forms one register, or do we have more than one register? My perception personally is that literature has more than one register. I mean, the way poetry is written is, okay, it is literature, but it's still different from the novel. I hope I am not mixing this concept now, register with genre, the various forms. For a large part of the history of thinking about literature, the answer to this would have been yes, more than one register. But at the end of the 18th century, however, when ideas of democracy and revolution began to challenge the stabilities of the neoclassical period, there was a parallel revolution in the register thought appropriate to literature. And so, at the end of the 18th century, I mean, prior to that, the idea was that, yes, literature has more than one register. But at the end of the 18th century onwards, the idea of register has been challenged. And so, saying that poetry has its own register, poetic register, or at least romantic poetic register, might not be, I mean, we could have more than one, again, register within the poetry or poetic register. I mean, if you look at the 3 lines on page 89 by T.S. Eliot in his The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, look at them. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Now when you read these, okay, the first 2 lines, no problem, they are poetic and conform with the poetic register. But as you move into the 3rd line, you get a jolt, like you get shocked, like a patient etherized upon a table. You are moved from the world of imagination, from literature to the what should I call it? Operating table in a hospital with surgeons around, like a patient, a simile, the evening sky. The evening sky is being likened to a patient anesthetized and on a table about to be operated upon, about to undergo surgery, etherized, unconscious because of anesthetic. The kind of medicine that we have when we want to undergo surgery, so that we stop feeling, or stop being conscious. And so here, the shock is largely produced by the way the third line jars with our preoccupations about the poetic register. Poetic register, poetry, and this is a love song, imagination, and suddenly we are removed from this reality into the operating table. Like shocking. And so, do we talk about poetic register or registers? Yet, as S.T. John Butler demonstrates, the fact that a text, any text, is set out on the page as poetry is itself a signal of poetic register, regardless of what the words themselves consist of. And so, the other review says that the fact that a text is written as poetry is in itself considered then poetry, and so a register by the mere fact of being produced as a poem or as poetry. The fact that a text, any text, is set out on the page as poetry, the layout of a poem, is itself a signal of poetic register, regardless of what the words themselves consist of. And so this poem by T.S. Eliot is a poem, is a poetic register, regardless of what the words mean. I don't know, I see here like register being, the word register being overlapped with or synonymous with genre. My feeling is that literature has registers rather than just one register, a variety of language. Because even if we talk about poetry, as a genre, the language used in poetry is not exactly the same like the language used also in a novel or a play. And so the form does not only, it seems, determine the structure, but also the register. We've already talked about the three factors determining the register: the mode of communication, the tenor, participants, relationship, and the field. Here I am thinking of the form, the genre. If we want to, under which of the three factors we discussed that determine the register, can we group or classify or sub-classify genre or form and register? We have the mode, we have the field, we have the tenor, the mode, the medium of communication. I'm not sure, this would require some thinking. Okay, that's it. That's all about this unit. Now we can move on to the second unit, unit 8. Language and gender.